about 50 miles from the border between Arizona and Mexico. Now, this landscape is tough, dry, and for much of the year, really, really hot. Now, people who cross the border region over land like this are facing big risks.
3,000 people have died just in our jurisdiction. We've identified about 2,000 of these 3,000 people. And the 2,000 we've identified, we know were undocumented border crossers. For the other 1,000, we don't know who they are.
We can't actually look at DNA profiles from those countries, and their families can't upload DNA profiles to our country. And there may be no fingerprint records, or frequently is not. So a lot of times those people, they've never known what happened to their loved ones.
We are talking about human beings. We are talking about loved ones of someone or a family that is waiting for them.
This YouTube edition of Catalyst is brought to you by Arizona PBS and Arizona State University. Life has problems. Science turns them into questions that can lead to solutions and even innovations. This is Catalyst, shaping the future through science research at Arizona State University. Hello, I'm Professor Vanessa Ruiz, and you're watching Catalyst. Now, we don't know exactly how many people die crossing the border each year, but when the bodies of those people are found, it is often very difficult to identify them, to find their families, and let those loved ones know what happened. Forensic scientists are the ones who have to solve these mysteries, and they need better tools.
I'm Bruce Anderson. I'm one of 3 forensic anthropologists here at the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner. So I was here from 84 to 90 before I went out in the Pacific. And I mention that because in those 6 years, even though a few migrants and smugglers would be found in the desert dead, it was a dozen maybe 20. So that was what the expectation was. Not many people would cross, not many people would die, and not many people would be found. But that would all change when I came back here in 2000 and we were hit with the first year of a quadruple increase in the number of bodies assumed to be or presumed to be foreign nationals.
We always get these calls from families saying that he crossed before and it was easier and now it is harder. He was walking for many days. And that's the thing, people are being pushed to the more remote areas due to the militarization of the border. So they are in the areas where most likely they are going to die.
We have a lot of border crossers. And this is a case where they almost never have proper identification. They don't just come from Mexico. They come from throughout all of Central and South America.
Now 20 years into this slow motion mass disaster where 3,000 people have died just in our jurisdiction, we've identified about 2,000 of these 3,000 people. And the 2,000 we've identified, we know were undocumented border crossers. We call them UBCs. Most were migrants on their way to a blue-collar job, a few were smugglers. For the other 1,000, we don't know who they are. We don't know even if they're foreign nationals. We suspect they are based on things like the items they were carrying and the stressors to their skeleton and maybe some of the paraphernalia they had with them. That's not enough of a lead.
Dr. Bruce Anderson is the medical examiner for Pima County. It is the largest Arizona county on the border with Mexico. Anderson is taking us inside the morgue.
The recovery of the body or the single bone is done by law enforcement, and somebody from this office will respond to the scene typically and receive the remains, whether it's a body or a bone, in a vinyl pouch, a so-called body bag. They're autopsied, which means the forensic pathologist looks at the remains and makes as many determinations as he or she can. We have people that died the same day they're brought in here, and we have people whose are represented by a single sun-bleached bone, which could be a decade or more old.
These are the body bags, the vinyl pouches that contain bodies and maybe just a single bone of unidentified folks. There's a few people that are probably going to turn out to be American, But of the about 100 bags, pouches in here, probably 99% we think are going to turn out to be foreign nationals. Whether they're identified or not, they tend to be partial skeletons. And because we can't release those remains to a funeral home for weeks or months or sometimes years, unlike the typical American who, if they have to come here for an examination, they're back to a funeral home in 3 or 4 days. So we're forced to use smaller body bags because we have partial skeletons. And we put more than one person on a tray, even though only one person per body bag. So this looks like there's going to be 3 partial skeletons, all thought to be foreign nationals. So if they ever get identified, they'll be migrants from Mexico or Central America. But right now, we're finishing up the exam, trying to make sure we have all the information we need for them, and then we'll release them for county burial or cremation.
This is our evidence lockup, and one of the things we store in here are what we call valuables, and those are the items found with the body in the pockets in a wallet. So we'll look at unidentifieds 2018, and I believe we had, from the migrants, we had 127 presumed to be migrants, and we identified about 30 of them, so there should be about 90 of these plastic sleeves if the person had anything. So we have a $100 bill, a wristwatch, and half of binoculars. Now, since most migrants don't carry binoculars, and very few, some do, but very few have US currency, especially $100 bills, this looks like a relatively nice watch. One interpretation of just this, if it is a young male, he was up on the mountaintops with his binoculars playing this cat and mouse game you've probably read about as far as when the smugglers bring loads over, whether those are drugs or money or people. So right now, the best explanation based on my experience is that this person, if these are his personal effects that we found with the body, he was more likely a spotter, therefore in the smuggling industry and not truly migrating here for a job. Now we don't know because he's unidentified. And even if we get him identified, the family may know. Or the family may know, but they don't ever want to tell us because it's either embarrassing or they fear that they're going to be prosecuted for something. So it's always hard with the smugglers. Well, if they're Americans, they typically have records, hospital or dental records somewhere. And if we can get a clue as to who they are, we try to secure those records and make a comparison. If they're not Americans, and because we're talking about the migration issue here, most of the migrants and the smugglers that are found dead are from impoverished parts of Mexico and Central America. But because of that poverty, they don't have the kind of records we have.
Because of the lack of records and any physically defining features in the bodies, scientists turn to a technique called isotopic analysis. It can't tell them who the person is, but it may help them know where the person came from. An isotope is an atom that has more neutrons than a standard atom of that element. For example, a hydrogen atom has no neutrons. An isotope of that atom will have 1 or 2 or more neutrons. This gives the atom a unique signature. So when scientists find isotopes in bones and tissues, they have clues to where a person may have come from. Dr. Gwyneth Gordon is working to improve the scope and accuracy of identifying where certain isotopes show up in the world.
A lot of elements, most elements, actually have naturally occurring isotopes. Where you live imparts a signature to your body. So where you're drinking water from, the oxygen and hydrogen that are in that water, they're going to actually form part of your tissues. They're going to form your hair, your teeth, your bones. And we know pretty well, actually often from climate change research, we know what the patterns of variation on the Earth's surface are. By measuring the tissues, we can actually say where someone is from. You know, your parents always told you, you are what you eat, and that's really true.
Much of what Gordon is working toward is what science calls validation. It means coming up with reliable, testable patterns and sets of data that show how these chemical isotopes build up and then reveal themselves in human remains. For Gordon's findings to be as valid as possible, she'll be drawing on help from a difficult place. She'll be working with sites that scientifically decompose human bodies. Donors who allow their remains to decompose on these sites have supplied important facts about their lives. Things like where they've lived, the foods that they've eaten, the kinds of things science needs to know if we're going to make isotopic analysis work better.
There's a lot of forensic case studies about understanding if you find someone's remains and they don't have any identification, you can use these same techniques from anthropology to figure out who they are. Tissues grow at different rates. So our hair and our fingernails grow pretty fast. From the hair, for instance, you can see a record of the last year, 2 years, 3 years. So there was a case in Utah called the Saltair Sally case. And this woman had very long hair. And they could tell that she had been migrating from the West Coast to Utah repeatedly over seasons. And this was eventually used to figure out who she was. And then you can also use, for instance, teeth, because they start forming even before you're born. And then the enamel on your teeth, once you're a young teen, they stop forming. And that signature of your birthplace is preserved even till you're 90 years old.
My name is Bobby Yang. I am a board-certified pediatric dentist. I've been here in the Valley since 2005. Kids are born with the permanent tooth buds already inside their mouth. So when they're born, they already have all the teeth that they need. There are some similar characteristics in different ethnicities. For example, like Asian people have more of an underbite sometimes, and the jaw structures might be different with different races as well. But it's typically hard to tell from one parent's mouth and look at another kid's mouth and say, aha, these kids are related or these people are related. Hi, Han. Hey. How you doing today, buddy? Good. Good, are you ready?
2 American kids are having their annual visit to the dentist. This boy is 15. His younger sister is 11. Both have the same mother and father. The shape of their teeth and jaws won't necessarily reveal that brother-sister relationship, but the isotopes in their teeth probably will.
Despite the fact that you think that your bones are very static, they're really a dynamic tissue. So they're replacing themselves about every 10 or 20 years. So by looking at teeth, bones, and hair, you can actually create someone's life history and understand where were they born, where were they living the last 20 years, where were they moving around in the last year. And that can provide incredible investigative leads to figure out where someone may be from.
So as these isoscape maps get worked out, we hope that we can provide a tissue sample, whether it be hair or bone or tooth, and we could learn a little bit more about the unidentified, because then we can save a whole lot of time by telling it's a man, he's 5'6" to 5'11", probably 25 to 40 years of age. Analysis of measuring his skull suggests he's admixed American Indian from Mesoamerica and European, perhaps. He had a lot of cavities to his teeth, and his isotope analysis suggests that he's from the mountains of Mexico. So we can save a lot of time if we can narrow that search. And with 1,000 people still unidentified and currently trying to be identified, anytime we can whittle down that potential list is a win.
While isotopic analysis may help identify deceased migrants on the border, the application is much broader. It can also help us understand how our ancestors ate and lived.
My name is Dr. Alexandra Greenwald, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Evolution and Medicine at Arizona State University. So I study the age at weaning and early childhood diet of ancient individuals from North and South America, and I do that using stable isotope analysis. So I start with human remains with permission from the descendants of the ancient peoples, and I section teeth, and I run these tiny millimeter thin sections on the isotope ratio mass spectrometer. to get the ratios of nitrogen and carbon isotopes. And this tells me through these little time slices of someone's early life what they were eating.
They use different isotope systems to understand where people used to live in the past. So I really got interested in it, and I thought, why can't we use this to study where people are now, in modern people?
It's gonna release some helium. For forensic challenges, we might use early childhood diet as a marker of where someone grew up. So in certain areas of the world, there are very specific diets, and that becomes more difficult in a globalized economy. And it also becomes more difficult in a food regime like we have in the United States, where there are lots of food additives that are derived from things with very clear isotopic signatures. So corn or maize has a clear isotopic signature. In order to get this data back, I load these very small samples of human collagen from teeth into these tiny tin capsules. So I load these tin capsules with standards and samples into the auto sampler. I set up the machine for a run, and the auto sampler drops one at a time each one of these tin capsules, and they combust. And when they combust, they release nitrogen and CO2 gas, which is then detected, and this gives me the isotope ratios that I use to estimate weaning.
The Mummies exhibit at the Arizona Science Center. 3 people from a family that lived and died in Hungary in the early 1800s. Centuries have passed, but isotopic clues are still here, still ready for us to learn from them.
My name is Zoltán Korsos, the director of the Hungarian Natural History Museum. Originally, I'm an expert in zoology, but now here I'm representing the Hungarian mummies. First of all, these mummies behind us, because they were mummified naturally. These are not artificially mummified bodies here. And they were all mummified by the natural conditions, but by the natural low temperature and low humidity, which was constant in the crypt. It's important because we know these people, everything about them. We know the date of birth, the names, even the relationships, the husband, the wife, and the child in between. And we could study the bodies by modern anthropological methods, and we could learn about their way of life, about their diseases.
So we can look at ancient people and combine our knowledge of how long they were breastfed and what they ate as children with the health outcomes that we see. So we can look at pathologies that are indicators of health or lack of health, and how those relate to their early life experiences.
But they have also other features which you can identify from the study, from the anthropological study, like whether they dye their hair, for instance, or they had head loss in the hairs, or how they handled the nails, for instance. Did they paint the nails or didn't? So there are lots of interesting features. What kind of teeth they had, for instance. What was the food? Sometimes we can even analyze the stomach content of these bodies. So there are a lot of interesting things which we can find out by the modern anthropological analysis.
Unlike mummies, bones and bodies found along the border are usually not well preserved. Animals may scatter the bones. They'll be bleached by the sun. This makes it more challenging to find clues like fingerprints, eye, and hair color.
After a few days or weeks, it can be impossible to get fingerprints off a body. And we have no other way to go, then we have to utilize DNA. And DNA analysis is expensive. It takes a few months. And for most of these folks, we have to find the family. We have to find blood relatives that can be sampled. Their saliva or their blood can be put together in what's called a family reference sample. And then that FRS can be compared to the DNA we get from the bone or the body. So it takes months, if not a year or more, versus a day or two if we had dental records or hospital records or fingerprints.
With this technique, it's actually really good, so we can tell, is this person from Central Mexico? Are they from Guatemala? Are they from Ecuador? And then you can try to, once you've got that area narrowed a little bit, you can then maybe use, if there are any personal effects, a shirt, pants, you can try to focus your appeals because a lot of times those people, they've never known what happened to their loved ones.
Gordon is working to make this forensic toolkit much more accurate. Her work could mean that more victims of crime get justice. It could also mean that more unidentified bodies become identified so that the people who cared about them can get answers.
Here's a partial skeleton, which is typical. He lay out on the desert floor on the Tohoto O'odham Reservation. When you get white bones, it means that the body was out there for maybe a year or more. The bones in our bodies right now are yellow. He had some camouflaged pants with him, which are in the body bag. And in those pants were these coins, 5 Guatemalan coins and a little ointment that apparently was made in Guatemala. Does that make him Guatemalan? No. It could be that that's a good lead for us to start. His age, which is probably 28 to 40, and a cranium, the upper part of the skull, that looks very much like it has some Native American ancestry. This is a very typical profile, if you will, for a migrant, somebody from Mexico or Guatemala, Central America. You contrast that with this young fellow. Now, he's much younger. He's maybe 15 to 19. His bones are still growing. This is the left radius, the left forearm bone, the outer one. You can see that line there means that he was still growing. This is a teenager. He had not reached his 20th birthday. So we estimate about 15 to 19 years of age. Well, while this guy died probably a year or two prior to him being found, this young man found in August probably died this summer. We wouldn't have this much mummified skin left. He should be easier to identify. He may not be married, but I bet he's got a mom. So we've already looked through all the records, Mexico, Guatemalan, Honduran, Salvadoran, for anybody who crossed the border in May, June, July of this year, who was that young, and we don't have any missing persons reports. If we could get an isotopic signature off of his bone and his teeth, and they were to tell us that he's from the mountains of Mexico, or he's from Northern California, that would be a big lead, as you can see. I'm pretty good at gleaning information from skeletons and dead bodies. I, like most forensic scientists who work in the medical legal world where you're dealing with that, bodies and bones, we build a metaphorical wall between that and our own feelings. I owe it to the family to do as good a job as I can without crying or sniffling or just shaking my head and saying, what's the use? And this is just one more. Thank God for people like Robin Reinecke and the Colibri Center for Human Rights, because they're better at talking to the families, and they haven't had the experience I've had of having my hands on a body or a bone or that photograph of a man and a woman and 2 small children. They don't have to deal with that part of it. They deal with the families and getting the best description they can for the missing person. And then at some point, the forensic anthropologist here, we meet with Colibri or the foreign consulates and kind of exchange information.
The Colibri Center in Tucson works with the medical examiner's office to identify these missing people and return their remains to their loved ones. Mirza Monterroso is the Missing Migrant Project and DNA Program Manager at the center. What's the time period between remains being found and the time if a family doesn't claim them? Mm-hmm. When do they go to the crematory?
It takes about 6 months to a year, depending on how much information this case has. If they think that there is hope, like they try very hard to keep them as long as they can. But when a case is like not many evidence, they have to just let it go like in 6 months or so. There is many barriers like the family have to overcome, like language and poverty, and like first of all they call us in like a bunch of anxiety and stress. They are very in a painful moment, like they don't knowing what's going on, where they have to go to search. They come to us in a very, very bad mental situation. They are very worried, and for a lot of these people it's just a death of life situation. They are going to die there anyway, so they try to come here and try to save their lives and try to improve their lives. These people deserve a chance to at least go home, go back and and their families need their answers. People are not seeing clearly that we are talking about human beings. We are talking about loved ones of someone or a family that is waiting for them. These are parents, these are siblings, these are kids of someone that they made the ultimate sacrifice to try to come here and provide their families with a good life. Colibri is hummingbird in English. Hummingbirds in many of the cultures in Central America and South America, it's a messenger from the dead to the people alive. Like, they believe that if a hummingbird comes to you, is someone from the other side send you a message. That's what we do, and yeah.
I'm Professor Vanessa Ruiz, and this is Catalyst, our show about how science looks for answers to questions that challenge our lives and our minds. And because science always has new questions to answer, we'll be back soon with more stories.
Catalyst is supported by Knowledge Enterprise Development at Arizona State University, advancing entrepreneurship, innovation, discovery, and knowledge for the public good.
Subscribe to this channel to see more episodes of Catalyst on YouTube.